Apache woman closed her eyes to die but woke up in a cowboy's bed instead. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The cold was sharper in the northern hills than in town, the kind of cold that made a man's teeth ache and his breath sting when he drew it in. Sheriff Luke Carver leaned forward in the saddle, gloved hands tight on the reins, his horse's hooves crunching through the crust of old snow. Patrols this far out were thankless, but he made them anyway. He told himself it was duty, keeping an eye out for drifters, outlaws, or hunters who thought they could slip through without paying tax to the town. But truthfully, it was the silence he needed. Silence meant no one asking questions he didn't want to answer. Silence meant no faces expecting him to fill the room with talk when he had nothing left to say. Luke was 32, still young by most measures, but his body carried the weight of years spent in uniform before he ever pinned a badge. The war had given him scars no one could see, and when he came west, he figured the land might give him peace. Instead, it gave him a badge in a town too small to matter to anyone but those living there. Still, he wore it, and he carried it like a burden. By daylight, he kept order. At night, he returned to his cabin, ate alone, slept alone, woke alone. He told himself he didn't mind. He was 2 hours from town, his horse damp with sweat, when he saw her. At first he thought it was a discarded bundle near the tree line, a dark shape against the pale snow, motionless. He slowed, scanning the trees for ambush. The raids had been real enough last fall, and settlers had been quick to take vengeance where they could, not always caring who they hurt. He touched the butt of his colt out of habit, then dismounted, boots crunching as he stepped toward the shape. It was a woman. She lay curled against a fallen pine, her limbs stiff from the cold, her face slack in unconsciousness. Her skin was bronze, her lips tinged blue, her hair black and stiff with frost where it spread across the snow. The deerskin dress she wore had been torn apart. One strap snapped, the fabric ripped along her ribs and hip. Bare skin showed through in the open gaps, skin that was bruised in places, raw in others. Luke's stomach tightened. It wasn't just the cold that had brought her here. Someone had left her like this, or worse, thrown her aside after using her. He crouched down and pressed a hand to her neck. A pulse beat faint under chilled skin, so weak he almost missed it. He pulled his hand back and looked around again, listening hard. No voices, no tracks fresh in the snow, but his own. Whoever had been here was gone. The only question left was whether to risk taking her in. He weighed it carefully. She was Apache. Her features, her dress, the beadwork still clinging to one strap of hide told him that. Bringing her to town would be a mistake. There were men in Cold Ridge who would sooner see her dead than sheltered, and women who would spit at her feet. He couldn't leave her, though. Whatever she'd done, or whatever someone claimed she'd done, leaving her here meant death, and he couldn't ride past with that on his conscience. His father had taught him better. Luke slid his arms under her, lifting her off the snow. She was lighter than she should have been, her body tense with chill, her breath shallow against his chest. She stirred once, eyes fluttering half open, and whispered a sound he couldn't make out. Maybe a name, maybe nothing. Then she sagged again, limp in his arms. The ride back was slow, the added weight dragging his horse, the sky turning darker by the minute. He wrapped his coat around her, keeping her pressed close, and tried not to think about how fragile her breathing sounded. Each time the horse stumbled, fear cut through him sharper than the wind. Fear that she'd slip away before they reached the cabin. Fear that the lawman in him was about to carry a body home to bury. By the time the cabin came into view, smoke from his last fire still faint in the chimney. His arms were numb from holding her steady. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and set her down on his bed, the only bed in the room, narrow and neatly kept until now. He laid her on the quilts, pulled the lamp closer, and took a long look. Bruises colored her ribs and thigh. Her shoulder bore a mark he couldn't place. Burned, not cut, old enough to scar but still red at the edges. Whoever had done this hadn't just abandoned her. They had broken her first. Luke lit the stove until it glowed, filled the kettle, and set broth to warm. His hands shook a little as he worked. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotions show. never had been, but the sight of her stirred something he didn't want to name. Pity, maybe. Anger, surely. But also a deep, steady resolve. When he touched a damp cloth to her lips, her eyes flickered open again. Dark eyes, sharp even in their haze, locked on his face for a heartbeat. She didn't speak, but there was no mistaking the fear there. Not fear of death, she had already given herself to that, but fear of what he might take from her before it came. Luke pulled back slightly, holding her gaze steady and calm. "You're safe here," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure she understood. "Not going to hurt you." Her eyelids sank shut, but her breathing steadied a little. Luke sat in the chair by the bed, waiting while the broth cooled, watching her chest rise and fall. He didn't know why she had been left there, or what kind of danger she would bring to his door when word got out. All he knew was that he couldn't ride past, not this time, not her. And that decision, made on a frozen night in the timberline, would change everything. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Luke let his eyes close, though he never really slept. He sat slumped in the chair beside the bed, one hand resting near his Colt on the table, the other still stiff from carrying her weight through the snow. Every small sound, the pop of sap in the stove, the hiss of wind squeezing through the cracks in the shutters, kept him half alert. Each time she stirred beneath the quilt, his head came up fast, the old soldier in him refusing rest. By dawn, his eyes burned from the long watch. When the first light pushed through the window chinks, he leaned forward and checked her breathing again. She was warmer now, though still weak. Her face had lost some of its blue tinge, and her chest rose more evenly under the quilt. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in years, he felt a knot of responsibility heavier than his badge. He had brought her here, and whatever happened next rested on him. He pulled on his boots, fed the stove, and went outside to draw water from the barrel. The world was white and brittle with frost, the snow piled high against the cabin's back wall. He paused at the door, scanning the tree line. No tracks but his own, no smoke in the distance. Whoever had left or died had done it far from here. Still, he knew men in town would ask questions if they saw her. Some would want answers, others would want blood. When he stepped back inside, the cabin air already warmer, he saw her eyes open for the first time with awareness behind them. She was lying still, her hair tangled across the pillow, her body pulled tight under the quilt. Her gaze locked on him as soon as the door shut, sharp and guarded, and he could see the flicker of fear tighten her jaw. He set the bucket down slow, keeping his movements calm. "You're awake," he said. His voice sounded rough in the small room, and he realized he hadn't spoken more than a few words in nearly a week. "Name's Luke Carver. Sheriff." She studied him, silent. He could tell she was measuring him, trying to decide if he was another kind of danger. He poured water into a tin cup, held it out. After a long hesitation, she pushed herself up on one elbow and took it with shaking hands. She drank in small sips, her eyes never leaving his. Her lips parted finally, voice hoarse. "Nayeli." Just one word, but it was enough to ground her as more than a body he had carried from the snow. Luke nodded. "Nayeli," he repeated, the name unfamiliar but steady on his tongue. He set bread and beans on the table, warming them in the pan, and brought a plate to her. She ate carefully, like someone who hadn't known regular meals in a long time, and he noticed the bruises more clearly now in the lamplight. There were marks on her ribs, welts on her thighs, an older scar burned into her shoulder. He looked away before she caught him staring, not wanting her to mistake his concern for something else. Still, he couldn't avoid the questions pressing against his chest. Who had done this to her? Why was she left to freeze? And why here, so close to the timberline where he always rode? She gave him no answers yet, and he didn't ask. He knew better than to push. Survival came first. Trust would take time. He stood, took his coat, and moved toward the door. "I need a ride into town, check the post," he said, pausing with his hand on the latch. "You'll be safe here. Firewood stacked. Stove will hold." He met her eyes again, holding them long enough to make sure she believed him. She gave the smallest nod, but her fingers clutched the quilt tighter around her chest. Luke stepped outside, the cold cutting him sharp after the cabin's heat. He mounted his horse, and turned down the trail, but his thoughts stayed behind. He replayed the image of her lying in his bed, eyes sharp despite exhaustion, body marked by violence and cold. He thought about the town, how they would look at her, what they would say if they knew she was under his roof. He had kept law here for 3 years, and never once had he invited anyone past his threshold. He had lived careful, kept his distance. Now one choice on a frozen night had broken that distance, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it. When he returned later with salt, flour, and coffee from the general store, she was sitting upright by the stove, wrapped in his quilt, mending the torn strap of her dress with the clumsy thread from his sewing tin. The fabric still hung loose, exposing more of her body than she likely wanted, but she worked with determination. Her eyes lifted when he came in. For the first time, they didn't hold fear. They held something harder to place. Wary acknowledgement. Maybe even the faintest trace of trust. Luke set the supplies down, his jaw tightening with the weight of it. Whatever her story was, it wasn't over. And whether he liked it or not, he was part of it now. The day stretched quiet inside the cabin, the kind of quiet that was not empty but filled with small sounds, with settling in the stove, water boiling, the scratch of a needle through cloth. Luke had returned from town with supplies and put them in their places on the shelves, all while feeling Nayeli's eyes follow him from her seat near the fire. She stayed wrapped in his quilt, her torn dress clutched underneath, sewing slowly, her fingers clumsy with the stiff thread but refusing to stop. He realized then that he had never asked her if she could sew or if she even wanted to. It struck him. He knew nothing of her life. Not where she came from, not how long she had been running, not whether she had family. People in town would have asked those questions right away, most of them with judgment already in their voice. But Luke had held back. He wasn't sure if it was kindness or fear of what the answers might mean. When he sat at the table, she lifted her head. Why? Her voice was rough, like each word cost her something. Luke paused, unsure. Why what? Her eyes stayed sharp, steady. Why did you carry me? You could have left. The question was fair. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the knot in the wood floorboards. Didn't seem right, he said finally. Ain't law to leave a body in the snow when it's still breathing. He wanted to leave it there, but the truth pushed harder. I seen too much of that in the war. Too many men walked past folks who might have lived if someone had stopped. Nayeli watched him for a long time before turning her gaze back to the dress. She didn't thank him. He hadn't expected her to, but her hands moved slower, steadier, as though his answer had taken some weight from her. By evening, she was strong enough to stand on her own and insisted on carrying a bucket of water from the barrel outside. Luke followed a few paces behind, ready to catch her if she stumbled. The cold bit hard at her bare feet, and when he noticed the raw skin, he silently fetched a pair of wool socks from his trunk and set them by the fire later. She said nothing when she saw them waiting, only slipped them on without comment, but he caught the way her shoulders eased once she did. That night, after supper, he lit the lamp and sat at the table to clean his colt. The cabin smelled of gun oil and beans cooling on the stove. Nayeli sat across from him, her quilt draped loose now, her dress patched enough to stay in place. The bruises on her shoulder had darkened, and in the lamplight he could see the scar burned into her skin more clearly. It wasn't an accident, too precise, too deliberate. He wanted to ask, but held his tongue. She wasn't ready to share, and he wasn't ready to hear what kind of men left that kind of mark. Instead, he asked something simpler. You got people somewhere? Her eyes flickered. She stared into the lamplight, as if weighing her words. Not anymore. That was all she gave, and it was enough to close the subject. Luke nodded once, slow. He didn't press. He knew what it meant to lose people. He had buried enough of his own during the war and after. He returned to his work, the steady click of the revolver's cylinder filling the room, and she returned to sewing, the two of them bound by silence that no longer felt like a wall, but like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Later, when the fire had burned low and the cabin chilled, Luke dragged his chair closer to the stove to doze light, the way he always did. But when he glanced at the bed, Nayeli had shifted to the far side, leaving a space beside her. Her eyes were half closed, but she was watching him still, steady as ever. He hesitated, his chest tightening, the decision sharp in his mind. If he lay down beside her, it would change things. If he stayed in the chair, the distance would stay fixed. He didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, settled back in the chair, and let his eyes drift shut. Her breathing steadied, and in that steady rhythm, he found a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. What he didn't see, as the fire cracked low, was the way she finally let her hand rest on the space where he might have been, testing the ground between them, waiting to see if it would hold. The storm came in sudden, hard, and without warning. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of lead, the trees bowing under wind that howled through the ridge like a freight train. Luke had seen enough winters to know what was coming. He checked the shutters twice, laid extra wood by the stove, and made sure the latch on the door was tight. By the time darkness fell, snow was hammering against the cabin walls and the wind drowned every other sound. Inside, the fire glowed, but the cold pressed through anyway, the kind of cold that slipped into bones and didn't let go. Naeli sat on the bed, wrapped in his quilt, watching him with wary eyes. She had eaten earlier, beans and bread, all she could manage. And though color had returned to her face, her body still carried the sharp lines of hunger. The patched dress clung unevenly, her collarbone stark above the neckline, her legs tucked under the blanket to keep warm. Luke could see her shiver even from across the room. He poured hot water into a tin mug and set it beside her. "Drink. Helps keep the cold out." She took it, her hands trembling against the metal, and drank slow. Her gaze flicked to the window, where snow streaked across the cracks. "This storm," she said, voice tight, "it will not stop soon?" Luke shook his head. "Could be all night. Maybe longer." She lowered her eyes, silent, then pulled the quilt tighter. Luke busied himself with small tasks, oiling the rifle, checking the kettle, but every few minutes his eyes returned to her. He could see the way she fought against showing weakness. Her jaw clenched even as her body shook. He understood it. Pride was all a person had when everything else was taken. But he also knew that cold like this wasn't a matter of pride. It could kill as quick as a bullet. Where shivering worsened, he made his choice. He set the rifle aside and crossed to the bed. She tensed when he sat down on the edge, her eyes locking onto his as if to read what he meant. He kept his voice even. "You won't make it through the night like this. The fire's not enough. Body heat's the only thing that works." Her lips pressed tight, her breathing quick. For a moment, he thought she would refuse, and he prepared himself to step back, to let her decide. But then she gave a single small nod, her hand still clutching the quilt as if it were her last shield. Luke pulled his boots off and eased onto the bed, careful not to crowd her. The quilt shifted as he lay beside her, the warmth of his body seeping across the narrow space. At first she stayed rigid, her back half turned, but the cold pushed harder, and finally she pressed closer, her forehead brushing his shoulder, her hand resting uncertainly against his chest. He felt her pulse through her fingers, fast, unsteady, but alive. He didn't move to hold her, didn't let his hands wander. He kept still, his breath even, his body heat given without demand. Slowly, her shivering eased. In the quiet that followed, questions surfaced, questions left unspoken since the night he carried her in. He wondered if she had been abandoned by her own people or sold off by settlers, wondered what violence had left the bruises, wondered how long she had been running. He also wondered what it meant that she was here in his bed, not as a woman he had claimed, but as a life he had saved. Naeli's breathing steadied against him, and at last her voice came, low and halting. "I thought I would die out there. I closed my eyes and waited. But I woke here." Luke turned his head, meeting her gaze in the lamplight. There was no gratitude in her eyes yet, not exactly, but there was a raw honesty he hadn't seen before. "Not on my watch," he said, his voice rough but steady. She studied him, then let her forehead rest fully against his chest. Sleep took her not long after, her hand still resting against him. Luke lay awake longer, the storm outside battering the cabin, thinking about what it meant to share his bed for the first time in years. It wasn't intimacy. Not yet. It was survival. But it had changed something between them, and he knew when the storm broke, nothing would be quite the same again. The storm broke by morning, leaving a world covered in deep drifts that reached halfway up the fence rails. The cabin stood steady, smoke still curling from the chimney, but the silence outside was heavy, almost smothering, as though the snow itself pressed against every sound. Inside, Luke moved carefully from the stove to the table, pouring hot coffee into a tin cup while watching Naeli stir under the quilt. She shifted slow, her face softer from rest, but when her eyes opened, the weariness returned like a reflex. She had survived the night, that much was certain. Her skin had warmth now, her breathing stronger, her shoulders no longer shaking uncontrollably. Yet Luke knew survival wasn't the only thing at stake. If she was to remain under his roof, questions would come. The town wasn't blind, and in Cold Ridge, nothing stayed secret for long. He set the cup down near her. "You'll need strength. We have to go into town." Her eyes sharpened instantly, her fingers clutching the quilt tight. "Town!" Her voice was hoarse, edged with fear. Luke nodded. "Supplies are low. Flour, medicine, a few things I can't go without. If I ride alone, folks will ask where I've been, why I need double the food. Won't take long before they come looking themselves. Better they see you with me, under my protection." She searched his face as though trying to measure whether he was telling her the whole truth. In her silence, Luke felt the weight of what she must have endured. Settlers who treated her as less than human, men who saw her as trade. He kept his voice steady. "I won't let anyone touch you. Not in town. Not anywhere." By mid-morning, the sky had cleared enough for travel. Luke saddled his horse and built a crude second seat from rope and blanket. When she stepped outside, wrapped in his spare coat that hung heavy on her shoulders, her eyes darted across the endless white as if she expected danger in every drift. She climbed onto the horse behind him, her hands light on his waist, not for closeness but for balance. The ride was long and slow, the snow deep, but the closer they came to town, the more tension coiled in Luke's chest. He knew Cold Ridge, knew every set of eyes that would follow them. He had kept his distance from most folk, respected for his badge, but never known well enough for talk. Bringing her with him would break that distance for good. When they reached the main street, heads turned immediately. A rancher paused mid-step outside the livery. Two women carrying baskets stopped and whispered behind their shawls. At the saloon, a pair of men leaned out into the street, grinning sharp and ugly. Luke kept his face hard, his hand resting near his belt, daring anyone to come closer. He dismounted in front of the general store and helped Naeli down. She kept her chin lowered, her dark hair falling across her face, but he noticed her shoulders squared, her back straight. Pride, even in fear. Inside the store, the owner, Ezra Maddox, froze at the sight of her. His eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. "Sheriff,"